Swedish-British journalist, filmmaker, political writer, and author of 5 books, Pelle NEROTH-Taylor, on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH-Taylor Show on this Tuesday afternoon, September 3, 2024. We've got going to talk a little bit about Germany and Eastern Europe now. We've got Richard Sakwa on as our first guest after my monologue. I think he's written the best books about the Ukraine conflict, the historical background to understand what's arisen out there in Eastern Europe. And he's also written quite a good book about Vladimir Putin, which avoids some of the histrionics and hugely dramatic claims that are put out. If you go into a local bookshop in London or New York, and you go to the historical current affairs section, you'll see pile after pile with books with the Putin as looking like a devil with horns, red covers, man with a gun, man looking like an assassin. Quite inventive, these cover designers, but it's all not good stuff, you can tell. He's been sort of thoroughly Hitlerized by most British, the journalistic, historical, current affairs blob that dominates, and good luck if you want to publish something different. Well, Richard's book on Putin, I think, takes a much more balanced view, and I think if you read that and his book on Ukraine, they wouldn't, and if our policymakers had read it, maybe our voters had read it, and certainly our journalists had read it and taken it on board and not listened to the sort of MI6 Russian-hating cabal that kind of dominates in the UK, then there wouldn't have been a war in Ukraine, and Ukraine would have been neutral, and hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians would not have lost their lives. Even if you disagree with it, Richard Sakwa's books are good reading, and they do give lots of historical background. So we're talking to him in a moment. We've got Erik Andersson on, who's been on my show before. He's a Nord Stream expert, and the importance of Nord Stream will become apparent when I talk about what else is going on in Germany, because, of course, Nord Stream cut Germany's access to cheap gas, and cheap natural gas from Russia via that undersea pipeline was what Germany was relying on for its economic miracle once they decided to ditch nuclear, which is a very good source of energy, for renewables, solar and wind in that North European country, which has gone, well, not so good. It's so funny, you always think of the Germans being ultra-rational, but that was a real leap into the dark and crazy. But of course, so Erik Andersson is going to talk about Nord Stream. What really happened there? Was it the Ukrainians who did it, which is kind of the semi-official version now, and Zelensky's denied it, of course. But that's the easy target. Or was it the British and the Americans, as other commentators seem to think, citing the professionalism of the event, which was basically an act of war by Germany's NATO allies against Germany. So you can see why the German prosecutors are kind of not realizing that answers are needed, are perhaps leaning into a patsy solution, much like Lee Harvey Oswald, anointed as a patsy back in '93, stopped investigation into much more serious possibilities. We've got these Ukrainian patsies who apparently are nowhere to be found. These people on their pleasure yacht decided to take a little leisure dive down in off the island of Bornholm, and just decided to carry out a little bit of industrial sabotage. Don't think so. So Erik Andersson, he's been out there on his boat. He's an engineer and a very smart guy. He'll be on in the second half of this hour. But back to Germany and its problems. As I said in my first hour, the elections have been held in the two East German Länder, and it's resulted in a huge success for the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. I don't say they're completely squeaky clean, and maybe they have Nazi roots, but they reflect. But on the other hand, people who know Germany much better than I do have said, well, they're really basically like the mainstream conservatives back in the 1980s, and the German people can't vote for the old CDU anymore because it's mutated into a new party, as has the left and the liberals, all the rest of it. So they vote for the AfD. I can't vouch for Germany, but I do know that the Sweden Democrats, Sweden is quite culturally affiliated with Germany. They're not a Nazi party. They're a mainstream kind of, slightly conservative party, and the Swedish alternative for Swedish conservatives is the moderate party, which is pro-war, pro-immigration, has been, and and light blue, and is a sort of liberal party. So the Sweden Democrats do not deserve the Nazi label, and maybe the AFD don't deserve the Nazi label. And the other party that did well, sorry, at the risk of repeating myself, the Sarah Wagenknecht party, they're definitely not right wing, and they're definitely not Nazi, but they look after the little guy, as it were. And as Jim Robin, my last hour, told us, it's often the little guys, the ones working on minimum wages, who are most affected by immigration. So you could be in favor of immigration, you could be pro-Palestine, as I am, and against mass immigration because it lowers wages and outcompetes the most vulnerable in our society. Anyway, so in the wake of this success of the German parties, it's also, I think, very much because of the very high prices that we've seen in Germany as a result of the demolition of Nord Stream and the gradual deindustrialization of the country that's resulted and is sending shockwaves through the country. Volkswagen, for instance, has just talked about unheard of, the very emblem of German technology and German engineering. They've got 600,000 workers all around the world, about half of them in Germany. They've never closed a factory in Germany. There are kind of cast iron guarantees between the management and the workers in that country where famously take workers' right seriously. And the bombshells have been dropped just yesterday or this morning that they might have to fire workers because of lower demand, but also higher energy prices. And why the higher energy prices? I think the energy prices, electricity prices are twice as high in Europe as they are in China or America. And China, of course, has much lower wages, and America is more competitive generally. So these are bad news ahead for the German economy. And as I said, that's one of the reasons why we have this political crisis in Germany, if you are one of the establishment parties. But we're going to talk about this and more with Richard Sakwa, who I think will be on very quickly after the next break. This is the Pelle Tele Show on TNT News Talk. Back after the break.
Lies. We're being told lies by greedy foreign developers who want to build renewable energy projects in Australia. They are not good for the environment. Thousands of hectares of productive farmland will be cleared and native wildlife will die. These developments promise clean energy, but at what cost? Let's help protect our communities and their irreplaceable way of life. Let's rethink renewables. Take 2 minutes to learn the truth about the destruction they cause. Go to letsrethinkrenewables.org.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's News Talk.
News and information.
Today's News Talk. TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle Tele Show. Now, my next guest is going to think I say this to all guests, but I don't. Richard Sakwa is the Emeritus Professor in European politics and Russian politics at the University of Kent. And I remember reading his book about Ukraine a couple of years ago, and it completely changed my perspectives. I kind of knew that something was suspicious about the mainstream medias. And I know I've covered Eastern Europe for decades, and I know this cabal of East European experts. They're completely deranged, and I knew not to trust anything, but I didn't have anything to put against them. But Richard Sakwa, his book Frontline Ukraine from 2015 is a great book on the history of Ukraine, that understands Russian thinking on the whole conflict. And he's just written a book about, not just, a couple of years ago, wrote a book about Vladimir Putin called The Lost Peace, I think it is, that traces his background in a far more normal way of describing the man that kind of chimes in with the descriptions of people like Tucker Carlson, probably the most popular journalist in the world, saying he's not a conservative, he's not a raving lunatic, he's a kind of almost like a liberal, and he's met so many politicians in Washington, so you can compare that. And of course, what I'm saying is absolute heresy if you're appearing on a mainstream UK show. Anyway, we welcome to the show, Richard.
My pleasure.
You published this book on Ukraine a couple of years ago, and the news thing is, of course, that Germany. I want to focus a little bit on Germany. The Germans are voting for the AfD, and whatever else you might think about them, the issues on views on immigration, they're pro-peace or pro-negotiations with Russia, and so is Sarah Wagenknecht party, and that's 50% of the population in this East German Länder voting for peace party. Now, Merz, the CDU candidate for next year, has also talked about peace, although he was quite hawkish before. The trouble is, the Germans have been deluged with insane amounts of propaganda about Putin and Ukraine, but I think your books put it right and give us a more nuanced perspective about the Ukrainian history and its connections to Russia. Can you start telling us about the Ukraine book and what its main points are?
Yeah, I think that before doing that, just picking up on your earlier statement about the media and the way that the whole issue is covered, the way I now look at it is that in the West, in what I call the political West, which is just to say the collective West or whatever you want to call it, this is a very peculiar thing which has emerged since the Second World War and after the end of the Cold War in 1989. It became this idea of unipolarity or hegemonic leadership, with NATO and all the other elements. And the way I see it is that this political construct has become, and I'm sorry to use the term, hypernormal. It's so normal that nothing can stand against it. Everything that stands against it is considered abnormal in the way that you were just suggesting, that critics of the war, critics of NATO enlargement, critics of policy towards Ukraine are considered somehow aberrant and in fact not even acceptable within a polity. But of course, they are actually defending democracy. You may not like some of the things they say, but democracy is all about dialogue. It's all about accepting within a political process, as long as you accept the constitutional rules of the game. So hyper-normalization in international politics means that countries which stand against this hegemonic force, this dominant force, this US leadership and so on, are considered not just mistaken, but evil in some fundamental way. And of course, nowadays, this is being applied to China. And when it comes to all of this, then focuses on Ukraine. And unfortunately, Ukraine has become the cockpit of this larger, if you like, meta-political, again, sorry for the term, but, huge dynamic conflict of our times. And if we look at it in these terms, it's a tragedy for Ukraine, of course, because most of the Ukrainian people, I've been many times there, overwhelmingly did not want this radical Ukrainian nationalist alliance with neoliberals in Washington and London, and indeed Warsaw, Brussels. They didn't want it. They wanted neutrality. They wanted to be able to take the best of their cultural heritage with Russia. Of course, we all defended, I've always said, a sovereign, independent Ukraine is what we wanted, but neutral, because it is where it is. Just like Mexico joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be unacceptable for the US. Missiles in Cuba in 1962, unacceptable to the US. So, but why should, this, where Russia has had 1,000 years of contact with Ukraine, this, again, I stress, does not negate the struggle for Ukrainian sovereignty, autonomy, development, and democracy, but not as part of this hypernormal West.
And people don't realize that. I had prepared. I looked at, there's a polls by the Gallup Institute and by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly went to Ukraine in 2010. So before all these conflicts started, and the rapporteur, you can find it on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly website, says only 20% of Ukrainians want NATO membership. And even in 2014, according to Gallup, in eastern Ukraine, there was like 8% support for NATO. And there was more support because that was after the February crisis in West Ukraine. And then another poll from 2011, also cited by Gallup. I wish we could put things up on this on our show, but we don't we don't have what's the word, pictures. But you can find it if you Google it. Show that Ukrainians before the conflict, 20% of them wanted to literally join forces with Russia. I mean, like have a Scandinavian type of relationship, intra-Scandinavian, with no passports, no borders, no checkpoints. No, 60% wanted that, a Scandinavian type relationship with Russia, and 20% actually wanted to be absorbed by Russia, and only 8% wanted a cold relationship with formal borders. Isn't that incredible? I mean, it backs up your every point. Very little support for NATO. And that 20%, I guess, is the population of the Donbass. They actually wanted absorption into Russia. And nearly all other Ukrainians actually wanted to have a very close relationship like Norway has with Sweden. And that chimes with what you said. But the media have painted it differently, haven't they? Because I think what happened then? I mean, why are we where we are now? What was what led to the polarization and the troubles?
Yeah. It's that those ambitions of dominance by this so-called political West. This isn't just NATO; it's European Union as well. Because if you remember, Gorbachev wanted a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, a peace order. So instead of which we have this sort of self-enclosed unity, which simply cannot accept, for example, as you say, Ukraine and Russia have been linked by endless family ties. The border used to be absolutely porous. I used to travel backwards and forwards, even after independence, until it became tougher and tougher. And as you say, Ukrainian people voted twice for peace. They wanted, this was in May 2015, even after you call the events of 2014, others call it a coup, which was effectively overthrowing the Yanukovych, who wasn't particularly, he was pro-Russian, but he was also pro-Western. He was the one pushing forwards and negotiating with the EU for the association agreement. And in a second time they voted for peace was when Zelensky, the leader today, in April 2019, got 70% of the vote. It wasn't a vote because he was such a great man. It was because he promised peace. And of course, very quickly after that, if you like, that awful coalition of, on the one hand, Ukrainian radical nationalists, on the other hand, neoliberals who want, market privatization, etc., united, and of course defeated him, though they've got different interests. And so twice what the people wanted was repudiated, because the idea was the right thing to do is to join NATO, join the West. Whereas you say, vast majority of the population wanted either neutrality or good relations with Russia.
So, I mean, what we talked about in the last 10 minutes should completely overturn most people's perceptions of this war, because they say Ukraine was minding its own business. It was pro-Western. It was heading in towards the free countries from the evil bastards in Russia who want to just dominate and occupy them. Well, I mean, surely, and then Ukraine can do what it wants. They can join whatever organization. Even Mearsheimer says that, he takes a realist argument, but he seems to assume that the Ukrainians were right to want to join NATO, but they couldn't be allowed to because it's not politic in that region of the world. But if the Ukrainians don't want to, and they feel very close to Russia, we never hear that story. They see them as family, all apart from the West Ukrainians, who were never part of the Russian orbit because they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for centuries, and a very oppressed minority there. I mean, I sometimes think that the West Ukrainians, I mean, I was reading A.J.P. Taylor on the minorities, and they weren't even called Ukrainians, they're called the Ruthenians, and he said it's the most quiescent and oppressed minority. They don't have hardly any representation in Vienna, and the Poles have been really bad to them down the centuries. And these are the guys who are now venting the oppression they've received from the West, countries west of them, to the Russians. I mean, it's like a projection of the violent racism they've probably been subjected to down the centuries. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. It's exactly. It's like the country has been hijacked by a small minority, but they have been empowered because it actually suits the United States and the Western powers. Because the last thing they wanted, as Brzezinski said in his famous book, remember Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, in a book called The Grand Chessboard, he said that Russia and Ukraine should not be allowed to, really associate too closely, because that would make Russia an empire. I don't know why he should have said that. He would have just said, just allow normal relations. But the West has been intent for 30 years to prevent normality. That's why I call this hyper-normality of the West, because it was something so absurd. I mean, I've been complaining about it for 20 odd years, that this is just absurd. And this would, and I've been warning also, this would lead to war. And many within Ukraine, I'm speaking with Ukrainian voices, they said, look, if we're forced to choose, Russia and Moscow simply could not ignore it. I mean, just simply one fact. If Sevastopol, which is a naval base in Crimea, fell into American hands, it would be the biggest defeat of Russia in 1,000 years. I mean, anybody, you don't have to be a realist even to understand that. And yet the West was so blinded by its own vision that it was the fount of all truth, and geopolitical interests, of course, coincided with that. So it led to a conflict which was endlessly warned about, but so easily avoidable by simple compromise. Ukraine will not join NATO. And it's symbolic, NATO and all the other stuff.
Yeah, and because they were even allowed to, Putin had no problem in joining the EU, right? But I mean, as I understand it, back in 2013, the reason why Yanukovych said no was that the Russians offered a better deal, because we see now with the Poles blocking agricultural produce from Ukraine because it's too cheap for them, that it would have, and even now when there's an enormous moral case for allowing Ukraine to export food. In 2013, they wouldn't have been allowed into the EU. So it's been a very one-way relationship, I understand, which would have benefited the Ukrainian elite, but wouldn't have benefited Ukrainian farmers, and it would have cut off their trade links with Russia. So they would have been losers from the EU association agreement. And that's partly why Yanukovych rejected it. Am I correct there? Or
Absolutely. Amazingly enough, the association agreement, which was due to be signed in November 2013, was only produced in an English version. And then when Moscow said, look, Viktor Yanukovych, have a look, this is the Russian version, he read it. And then he understood the enormous implications of it. And don't forget that throughout 2013, Moscow and Kiev had been saying, look, let's have a discussion with Brussels on how we can sort this out. Let's negotiate. And Brussels then said to Moscow, keep your, I paraphrase, keep your nose out of it. This is none of your business. And how do you mean this is none of our business? It's precisely our business. We buy Ukrainian steel. We buy the engines. We buy all sorts of stuff. Our economies are interlinked. And you're telling us this is none of our business. It was so absurd, that European Union position, that ultimately it also bears a huge responsibility for exacerbating the geopolitical conflict and the security. And of course, this association agreement also talked about Ukraine's alignment with Brussels' security policy. And when Yanukovych said that, he said, what on earth has this got to do with an economic trade deal?
I was interviewing Hans Blix the other day, and he said that security clause was inserted by the terrible twins, the Swedes and the Poles, Sikorsky and Carl Bildt. Carl Bildt, I know of him very well. For 30 years, he's been trying to destroy Russia. And sadly, the Swedes, of course, who lost their empire, North European empire, after trying to fight Russia and about to do so again, it's like what's the word, catnip for certain Swedes. Yeah. They've been neutral and peaceful and minded their own business. Russia, and Carl Bildt and a certain segment of Swedish society, the militarists and so on, they're obsessed with, avenging the Battle of Poltava. They still think about that. They still raise their glass to it at parties and things like that. Carl Bildt was a foreign minister, of course, and Sikorsky, and they both bear large responsibility. According to Blix, they inserted this security clause because they wanted to trap the Russians. They wanted to screw the Russians over because they wanted to basically have a security aspect to this whole thing. So in a way, they're betraying the Ukrainians as well and making them out and trapping them. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. The Ukrainians are the victims in all of this, these larger geopolitical games. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian elite and those people who came to power in February 2014 simply were willing accomplices to the destruction of their own state. So paradoxically, people like me who've been criticizing the policy, in defense, I've been criticizing the way that Ukrainian state policy developed, but not the Ukrainian, if you like, national idea. And the two became can I just say that, as you say, Poltava 1709 has never been forgotten or forgiven in Sweden. And of course, that terrible too, Sikorsky and Bildt also were the inspiration for the Eastern Partnership of 2008-2009, which was quite explicitly, I asked him at one point, Sikorsky, and he said, yeah, of course it was all about spheres of influence, expanding the West. Whereas, when you say Russia doesn't it have a legitimate security interest, that's 19th century thinking. And it's an extraordinary application of double standards, which is so inherent to the system now. Yeah,
exactly. So they're saying the Russians are concerned about the zones of influence, but they're very explicit that they want to extend the Polish zone of influence into Eastern Europe. It's these borderlands. And I think it's like the Poles, they just got rich and peaceful for the first time in their history, and they can't stop getting into geopolitics. They can't calm down. Terrible. We're just going to go into the news, Richard, and we'll be back with more. We'll talk maybe a little about Vladimir Putin after the break. This is the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on TNT News Talk. Back after the quick news break.
Today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show. Well, we've got Richard Sakwa with us, who's an Emeritus Professor of European Studies and Eastern European Studies at the University of Kent. And I highly recommend his books. I don't usually do that. I don't do it to every guest. Frontline Ukraine and The Lost Peace. Maybe if you read these books and took them seriously, there would have been no devastating war bordering on World War III risks in Eastern Europe. Richard, You wrote The Lost Peace, which brings the argument up to 2020, I think, when the first edition came out. What are the main points about that? And tell us a little bit how you would describe Putin in that book, which is less more level-headed than other accounts I've seen.
Yeah. So The Lost Peace came out just last year, and it's about how we messed up the post-Cold War possibility of a positive peace order. I think the book we're thinking about, sorry, we didn't have time to discuss it earlier, is called The Putin Paradox, in which I try to define the contradictions and complexity of the Putin phenomenon. Indeed, on the one side, he's one of the most reviled leaders of our time. On the other hand, there's a very strong argument which can be made that he's stabilized Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the devastating economic crisis of the 1990s, and indeed the country was in danger of going the way of the Soviet Union because Russia covers 11 time zones, 148 million people, at least 156 what we call native peoples within Russia. So it's a whole little empire by its very mere fact of its existence. And yet today, the country is more united than it's ever been. It's a sort of a corporate state. It's a type of relatively authoritarian state. But until this war, it wasn't so different from, if you like, Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. Yes, it had a developmental agenda. It wasn't just simply about repression and violence. A developmental agenda which was delivering the goods. Maybe other ways could have been achieved to deliver these goods better. I don't know what the way would be, but it did deliver rising living standards. And if you look at the major cities, not just Moscow, St. Petersburg, they've been absolutely transformed.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, I was going to say, I spent a lot of my early journalistic career, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe. And I was actually in Moscow for the putsch in 1991. I was a student journalist, and I just happened to be there. But I spent a lot of time traveling around, in the type of hyperinflation. The Russians were all extremely badly dressed, the cars were these Lilliput cars, terrible. And there's nothing to buy in the shops. And I sometimes wonder if the UK-based journalists writing about Russia have been there since 1993, because I tried to send these people who are my frenemies, if you like, these YouTube videos of young Russians dancing to Russian pop music. They're well dressed, they're fit, they eat well, beautiful cars on the street, everything is extremely clean. The supermarkets are absolutely packed with food, and they seem to be normal free. I mean, there is a kind of autocratic feel to the place slightly, but let's not exaggerate it too much. And then they say, well, that's just Kremlin propaganda, or that's just in the big cities. And then I find a shopping center, a supermarket in a small town, and they say, well, I don't know, that you're lying about that or something. It's very difficult to get through. But as you said, Russia's been transformed completely, and for that alone, he should be commended. And then I talked to a lot of Russians who, I said, is Russia free or not? I mean, on this show, because I want to get the truth. And they say, yeah, we can say a lot of things on Telegram and so on. And I'm not afraid on the knock on the door. And I think a lot of people are afraid that they're stuck in old black and white films of the Cold War. They think that they live in a gulag where they eat potato soup and live in total fear of the knock on the door in the night. But it's not like that, is it really?
Yeah, it's nothing like that, not like Stalin times. This is a continuation of Khrushchev-type thaw. Yes, as you say, there's a heavy-handed management of the political system. But as I say, if you compare it to Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, it's tough. It's repressive. And of course, as the second Cold War has intensified, there's been less freedom in the media. But there's still, people are not frightened obviously in these wartime conditions now, things have changed, but right. and the media and everything else has been limited. But it's always a balance. And of course, we would always like to see more freedom, more independent journalism and so on. Yet, this is a historical phase. And, what's so sad is that Russia was developing, as you suggested, along a more normal pattern. And once again, it's caught up in a global geopolitical conflict, which was not really of its own making, because this is, certainly not even just Putin's. Gorbachev before and Boris Yeltsin and Putin all said, look, you're going to expand this military alliance to our borders. Well, we can't accept that. Ukraine can develop and other countries in their own way, but geopolitics has to mean that we have a sphere of security. And the West ignored it. Many in the West, of course, complained as well. George Kennan and a whole list of people, of course, warned about it as well. So it isn't just the Russian leadership. So it's a tragedy that Russia as well has been caught up in this conflict.
So, yeah, in a way, because what you're saying is, I mean, there's a poll on free speech. I mean, at least 50% of Russians don't think you should have any censorship of the internet. So it's not quite as high as American or Scandinavian levels of 70 or 80%, but still half of them don't believe it. And so Russia's going in the right direction. But all these attacks from the West, calling the Russia authoritarian dictatorship, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they treat Russia badly and Russia has to be authoritarian to survive. And then they said, oh, we told you Russia was authoritarian dictatorship. In a way, if they just left Russia alone, maybe it would become a much better democracy in 5 or 10 years. Anyway, your last book, I'm sorry, I confused the Putin book, which came in between. That's the one I read. I haven't read your latest book. Tell us what the main themes are of that then.
Yeah, the Lost Peace suggests that after 1989, at the end of the first Cold War, under leadership of Gorbachev, there was a chance to reset European and global politics entirely. That's what Gorbachev wanted in his famous speech at the United Nations in December 1988. He appealed to the international system, if you like, the spirit of 1945, the alliance of the Soviet Union, United States, United Kingdom, and others. And this was possible. Yet in Washington, they decided, hang on, who is this upstart Gorbachev? Why is he seizing the ideological initiative? We've really got to put him and Russia or the Soviet Union in its place. And then we had the drive of the neocons in Washington for global leadership dominance that the Soviet Union, in 1991 collapses. And they say, look, Russia's weak. We could ignore its concerns and we can expand our alliance and indeed our ideological sphere. So what they then basically said is that instead of sticking to United Nations idea of sovereign equality, some countries were more sovereign than others, in a sense that democratic internationalism, that you only really accept it if you assume our model of socioeconomic order, neoliberalism, and so on. And that sets a whole dangerous element going. And instead of a positive peace, the sort of positive peace talked about by John Kennedy in 1963, a peace which isn't a peace which is developmental and so on, we have a negative peace which just got worse and worse. So this is why I call it the lost peace. We lost it in 1945, 46, when the first Cold War began. We lost it again in 1990s once again. And we are, as you hinted at earlier, this Cold War is in the foothills of the Third World War because that fear of nuclear annihilation in the West seems to be remarkably dulled. And, in October 1962 in Cuba, we were all scared. Why aren't we so scared now? I'm scared. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I am. But I don't know. I think it's young people, young politicians. They get younger and younger. And of course, I mean, I don't think Liz Truss had ever heard of Gorbachev, And then they've adopted this neocon talking point that is nuclear blackmail by Putin. We mustn't give in to Russia's nuclear blackmail, right? Do you want to F around and find out? Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, it's fantastically irresponsible. We've only got time for a last question, Richard. I want to tell you about the Swedish role in helping Gorbachev, because Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated, but he was quite close to Gorbachev, and Arbatov and so on were conduits of. I think Gorbachev looked at Scandinavian social democracy. We'll have some of that, and then the Russia got neoliberalism instead. But that will be for another time because I wrote a book about it. Do you think that the claim that they wanted to use Ukraine as a template for slicing up Russia into 5 countries of about 30 million people each and have 5 vassal satellite pro-Western leaders to steal Russia's resources? The West says that's conspiracy theory. A lot of Russians seem to believe it. Do you think there's any case that's what the West wants with Russia?
Well, I wouldn't put it in that way, because this is the idea of an apocryphal statement by Madeleine Albright, which is much quoted in Russia, but it's actually apocryphal. But certainly they wanted to contain Russia and using Ukraine to do that. Yeah, that's for sure.
Right. Okay. Richard, thank you so much. Fantastic books that you've written. Highly recommend them. As I said that before. Love to have you on again. Emeritus Professor at the University of Kent and a wise observer of East European politics. And we're certainly all worried about the possibility of World War III. Well, we're going to go on to our next guest, and we're going to talk about Nord Stream and the German position and where Germany goes now if there are revelations about Nord Stream unflattering to the West and to Ukraine. We'll be back after the break. This is the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on TNT News Talk.
Pelle NEROTH Taylor, live from Sweden on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show. Well, as I've been saying, Germany's just had an election. The Germans are very unhappy. They've got very high energy prices. Volkswagen says the emblem of German success and technology, says they might have to close down some of its plants in Germany because of high energy prices. Well, why are the energy prices so high? Well, partly because they stopped using nuclear power, but also because their main source of energy was cheap gas from Russia, which, of course, was stopped by Nord Stream in the war in Ukraine. The explosion, the biggest act of industrial terrorism since the war, or perhaps ever, was conducted in 2022. The Russians were instantly blamed. No one thinks the Russians really did it. But then the story came out by Seymour Hersh that it was actually the Americans and maybe the Brits who did it. And that story's been floating around unofficially because no one really wants to talk about it. And now the Germans are saying, well, actually, it was the Ukrainians, a bunch of drunken amateurish Ukrainians who did it off the back of a yacht, a pleasure yacht. Well, is that plausible or is that just a patsy story? And but anyway, and where's Germany going to go from here? Will they finally recover their mojo? And is this a first step in standing up to the Brits and the Americans? Well, Erik Andersson is an engineer who's worked for Volvo and Boeing. He's now living in Western Sweden. As he's been investigating Nord Stream for years, and he's been on this show before. Welcome to the show, Erik.
Thank you. Good seeing you again.
Tell us about this latest story that was published in the Wall Street Journal and what the Germans seem to be following up on. What is that story, and do you believe it?
Well, I mean, whether I believe it or not, I mean, we have to be relating to this story somehow, because when the mainstream is spending so much money in telling us that this is what we're supposed to believe, and then politicians are actually acting on it. I mean, the story gets a life of its own, in a way.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a bit like a Hollywood thing. I mean, the Germans issued an arrest warrant. Actually, a German judge issued a European arrest warrant for a Ukrainian sports diver living in Poland. You know, his name is Vladimir Suravlev, and this guy somehow he was caught on a speeding with a van, and he was caught on a picture, and therefore they think that's him. But it's really weird. This was issued in the beginning of June this year, and by the beginning of July, nothing had happened. And then the German Chancellor Scholz was there allegedly trying to tell the leadership of Poland that they should do something about it. But they obviously didn't, because on the 6th of July, he allegedly traveled back to Ukraine in the Ukrainian embassy vehicle. So is obviously then protected not just by Ukraine, but also by Poland.
Mm. And then there was this war of words between Poland and Germany, wasn't there?
Donald Tusk told us everybody to just shut up.
Right.
All this, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Tusk was saying, you know, they've been having a war of words for decades. You know, the Germans. My Polish friends seem to hate Germany as much as I hate Russia. Not a good idea to hate everyone around you. You know, I always say that to the Poles. Yeah. So Tusk was saying, you mind your own business. You know, I can't remember. You've been supporting Russia for many years anyway, and you've been enabler of Russian tyranny and so on. And then the Germans haven't come back to them. But anyway, we'll see how that develops. So do you think there was a Polish-Ukrainian component? Were they this Ukrainian yacht, was it out there in those seas at that time outside Bornholm? And would you think it was used as a patsy? So they had two projects. One was the real one, which Ulla Ternandez talked about, and Seymour Hersh, American divers with expensive gear diving off an American battleship, and then you had this small ship that could be used to put all the blame on when the need arose. Is that what you think happened?
Yeah, well, I think, the boat trip happened. There's lots of evidence that the boat trip actually took place. there are lots of witnesses. Right. They docked in several ports, and in all of those dockings, there are, witnesses talking about them, and also some pictures of the boat, etc. So I think there's no doubt about that, and so no doubt that the boat trip was suspicious, with the forged passports and paying big piles of cash and stuff like that. So the question is whether this was intended as a patsy from the beginning, or if they actually conducted the sabotage. And right. I'm a bit sort of neutral on that. I think from my observations, from my investigating the scene, taking footage and sonar images, I think it's quite consistent with a small operation with sports divers. It's also my discussions with other advanced amateur divers. It's not a big deal to dive to those depths. They've actually, in many respects, surpassed the capabilities of professionals or military divers, because they are not anymore. They're not trained to do this kind of quick operations down to big depths.
Right.
That's not what they do.
I'll defer to your analysis, because you've actually been out there and you've done much more work. So I'll put two theories side by side. One is that possibly they were patsies. Okay, that's a possibility. Second is they actually carried it out. What are the strengths of the Ukrainian yacht versus the American CIA divers? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of each hypothesis?
Well, one thing speaking against having like a big operation with very, very well equipped divers with full expensive with big budgets and things, speaking against that is that they made this huge mistake of putting two bombs on the same pipeline. I think it's obviously a mistake, and I think it's very likely it was due to them having magnetic compasses. They got disoriented because there is a deviation of the magnetic field in one of the places, and I think that's very easy to do if you're a low budget operation. If you have access to advanced gyro compasses and big portable sonar devices and things, and scooters with those, you're not very likely to make such a rookie mistake. So I think even if Hirsch is right, they would, and if they planned this as a patsy operation, they would also do the real operation consistent with a small operation. So they deliberately just put the bombs next to the pipeline, a little bit into the map. They did something you could have done in 20 minutes, just to fool then the investigations into thinking that this could be a small boat. So I think it's sort of by design anyway, very difficult to rule out the boat story with evidence.
Right. Because as you said, as you said, even if it was the big scenario, they would have to pretend it was a small scenario and behave in such a way. So it's kind of difficult.
Yeah, and Seymour Hersh has said that in interviews. He said, there were just two divers. He said they were incredibly skilled, but they were, doing it with just two divers. That's what he said. And, and obviously then it's not very different.
Okay. So you're saying, well, that's interesting. I automatically assumed that that these were just patsies and that no one would believe. It's a way to averting blame from the Americans. And you could be right. I'm totally open to that. However, what about, do you think the Americans, I can't remember that, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the Americans said it wasn't us and it was just these Ukrainians. But everyone knows that people like Biden and Victoria Nuland and everyone else is saying, if there is a war, these these pipes will not stand. I mean, Americans have been warning about this. So do you think the Americans had no foreknowledge if it was the Ukrainian scenario, or did they use the Ukrainians and give them the go-ahead?
I think they used the Ukrainians and gave them the go-ahead. I think it's absolutely unthinkable that the Ukrainians would do this just on their own without being totally confident that they had the blessings and the go-ahead from the USA. Also, the Polish reaction. I mean, the arrogance of Donald Tusk. I mean, he wouldn't tell everybody to shut up unless he had backing from the USA. Unless he felt that he was on the right side with it, and his big daddy supporting him in scolding the Germans on such a serious issue.
Yeah.
So I think that's what makes the Wall Street story quite interesting, as a story. I mean, if you just analyze it as a limited hangout or something, they had previously said that the generals did it on their own. Now they continue to say, okay, there was a drunken night. The generals got drunk and they came up with, let's blow up Nord Stream. But then they're also saying, when you read the article, that Zelensky himself ordered it back in May, and then when he tried to stop it, it was already too late. There's this passage where they say Zelensky wanted to stop it, and Zaluzhny, the top general, said it's too late. It's like a missile. When you push the button, you can't pull it back. Then it's going to fly and it's going to blow it up. So this was an admission that Zelensky was involved all the time, and him being involved and the Americans not being involved. It just doesn't sound believable, does it?
No. So the limited hangout part is that it puts all the blame on the Ukrainians, frees the American responsibility, so allows the Germans and the Americans to get close again, and puts all the blame on the Ukrainians, maybe as a way to get rid of Zelensky and maybe start peace negotiations and allow the Germans to stop sending aid to Ukraine, because they say this is our Germany, of course, is the second biggest supplier of weapons. Can we just discuss the geopolitics
common
of this now?
Yeah.
Yep. Over to you.
No, it's a common interpretation of pundits here that the days of Zelensky are now numbered, and so that's why they put this in, so they can get rid of him. They can sort of wash the hands of the USA. But it looks to me this only works for a special audience who are not so knowledgeable about the history of cooperation between America and Ukraine, and how much America has armed, and how much involvement there has been from the CIA and intelligence agencies, and how embedded they are into the Ukrainian military and so on. It just sounds. I mean, just reading the same mainstream U.S. papers, New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, they had articles about this, and so this story just doesn't ring very well together with all those other stories.
No, so you and I, who informed people, know that the Americans gave it's got American fingerprints all over it. But for the general public, do you so the political situation is, do you think this will allow the Americans to dump Zelensky and have the political backing for it now?
Well, I'm not the expert on the power intrigues in Ukraine. Right. I followed a little bit some forums, some Facebook groups that are big supporters of the guy who's been pointing out as the coordinator of the Nord Stream attack, the Chervinsky guy. And they are, they're very supportive of Zaluzhny, the general. They're very patriotic. Ukrainians, very pro-military build-up and war and against Russia. And they even blame Zelensky for being some kind of Russian plant. They call him the little green man. So I don't know. It seems like the alternative in Ukraine is even more sort of a warmongering nationalist fraction.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Exactly. So the Americans might want to keep him on. I mean, the Americans seem to be wanting to pull back from the war a little bit. So if that is their motive, and then it's in their interest to keep Zelensky on rather than get rid of him and get a stronger, more anti-Russian leadership on board. So where do you think Germany? Where's Germany going next now with this? Because the Swedes handed over their own investigations to Germany. It's like saying, "You Germany make the decisions. We don't want to get involved." Do you think the Germans? Well, are they going to cut down on their help to Ukraine after this?
I mean, concerning the investigation, I think my big question is: are they really serious about it? Because why did they wait so long to issue the arrest warrant? And they obviously had their eyes on the guy for a long time, and he was vacationing in Denmark, I think, and then visiting. In May, he was visiting relatives in Berlin and stayed there, and they didn't take him at that time. They waited until he got home to Poland, and then they go, like, they work in the bureaucracy. I mean, that's not the way you do with terrorists. I mean, if, let's say, that's not what the Americans did with Osama bin Laden when they heard he was hiding out somewhere in Pakistan. They go there with your helicopters and you try to grab him or kill him or something. But that's not what the Germans are doing. It's very lame what the investigation is doing. You don't even know if it's serious or if it's part of part of the theatrics to make us sort of be happy with the little story we get.
It's like wheels within wheels, wilderness of mirrors. Nobody quite knows what's going on, but at least there's some progress. Well, Erik, what are you doing next? We've got a minute left. Are you continuing to follow this investigation? By the way, you out there, listeners, just type in Wall Street Journal and Nord Stream and into Google News, and you'll get all the latest, because Wall Street Journal is behind a paywall. So what are you doing, Erik? Are you picking up any trails? I know you've been out there with your diving teams.
Yeah, I was still planning to go back there. It might be some logistical challenges, but I mean, there are some interesting aspects of it. I mean, there is a boot that's left. I mean, there is something people don't seem to believe generally, which is there were exactly 4 bombs and the exact placement.
Erik, sorry, we've got to wind up there. Erik Andersson, engineer investigating Nord Stream, a retired who used to work for Boeing and Volvo, and he tends to think that this Wall Street Journal article is genuine, and it was a Ukrainians in a small yacht. So Seymour Hersh was probably being fed a lie. So we can't always rely on people like Seymour Hersh. He's too much of an insider. Thank you so much. We're getting more guests and more analysis tomorrow on the Pelle NEROTH Taylor John News Talk.
If you missed this hour, simply go to episodes at tntradio.live.